Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Conversations on Race and Policing Sessions, number 4 in the 3rd year of this project. My name is Cecilia Smith. I am a recent graduate of Cal State USB, and I received my Master's of Arts in History in the inaugural history program in 2022. And today, we have a very interesting topic to discuss. It's Indian boarding schools. Before I do that, though, I would just like to acknowledge the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences and Interim Dean, Christina Hasija, for her participation in this program. Also, Fowl Library and our technical support, then Lee, Parker Brooks, and Jackie Patterson. And right now we have a very special guest, Assemblyman James Ramos, and I'd like to go ahead and introduce him and turn it over to him for the land acknowledgement.
Thank you so much. Where the school is located is on Yohavitam Serrano territory. And I want to do a land acknowledgement with the Serrano people and other tribes that are there on campus with you, specifically the elder there on campus, Robert Levi, who's Korea. So I just wanted to acknowledge that and offer a song. Shoy Bab no he no eva, Shoy Bab no he no eva, Haku pai patenaiva, Haku pai patenaiva. Shoy Bab no he no eva, Shoy Bab no he no eva, Haku pai patenaiva, Haku pai patenai. Ha! Shoy Bab no he no eva, Shoy Bab no he no eva, Shoy Bab no he no eva. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, very, very much. I'd also like to introduce our organizers for this event. We have Stan Fuchs, who is the president of the West Side Action Group, which has been in service for 50 years. We have Dr. Jeremy Murray, who is an associate professor in history at Cal State. And we have Dr. Daisy Ocampo, who I'm going to turn this over to right now for further information. Thank you very much.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So I'd like to kind of go a little bit off my order and just give a minute or two to Mr. Robert Levi, who tuned in. Robert Levi is an elder in residence here at Cal State San Bernardino, and I wanted to give him the opportunity to say hello and introduce himself as well. Are you there, Robert?
Be one, everybody. Yep. Pretty much James and Dr. Ocampo just pretty much said what I do on campus, and I'm just excited to be here and to talk about boarding schools, in particular Sherman Indian High School, where I worked for 2 years, and my parents worked there for most of their lives. So thank you everybody for joining, and let's get this interesting conversation going. And thanks for filling in for me, I guess. All right, take care.
All righty, thank you, Robert.
Daisy, can I just say, I didn't mean to interrupt, but sure. I just want to acknowledge the land acknowledgement and just to say that even though we don't know the words, sometimes you don't need words. And I think that was conveyed very, very nicely, Mr. Ramos.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, so I'm actually going to share my screen here. I was asked to provide just a little bit more historical content to our conversation today on Indian boarding schools. So I'll just go ahead and begin. Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Daisy Ocampo, and I am Kashkan or Kash Amo. I am an assistant professor of history here at Cal State San Bernardino. I want to thank you all for joining us this afternoon for a discussion on Indian boarding schools, especially as it pertains to race and policing, which is the topic of our gathering today. I wanted to provide historical background before introducing Assemblymember James Ramos. For many people, if we just recall a couple years ago, the discovery of human remains of children found throughout Canadian residential schools really shocked the world. We were all under COVID quarantine, and our news outlets, social media, and governments really grew attentive to the unraveling story, and the count of human remains continued increasing, if we remember. And it really revealed that residential schools were violent, they were more pervasive than thought, and really complicit with a lot of national governments and a lot of different churches as well. However, the vast majority of people in the United States were unaware that the US not only had its own history of removing Native children from their families, communities, and culture, but was home to the flagship school that really designed the boarding school model. And this school was Carlisle Indian Industrial School, located in Pennsylvania. So a little bit more of historical background in terms of why do you need boarding schools, right? So during the 1860s and 1890s, we really see an increase of Indian wars, which we can see on this map here. And these were all throughout the American West due to the settlement and really a lot of ideologies like manifest destiny. And in a nutshell, manifest destiny is this idea that primarily white settlers were destined by God to expand its dominion and territory to spread democracy and capitalism throughout the entire US. So from the East Coast all the way to the West Coast. Now, what do you do with all the Native nations that are already residing on these lands, right? That is the big question. And this led really to the removal of entire Native communities through warfare, through treaties, some of them still standing today, and Western schooling. So I'd like to draw a little bit of attention to a unique case study that happened. Hampton Normal and Agricultural Institute, which is located in Hampton, Virginia, was really this experiment into schooling in terms of how to really assimilate recently freed African Americans and Native Americans that were usually captives of war into white Protestant culture, right? How can we assimilate them to become what we want them to be? Now, the program for Native Americans did eventually end at Hampton, which is now Hampton University. As administrators there, actually learned that there were just better results. We'll talk about that in a bit. And at a cheaper cost at a school called Carlisle Indian School, located in Pennsylvania. And here we see a photograph from the archives at Hampton. And at Carlisle, what was the driving philosophy behind their educational system? So we have this famous quote, "To kill the Indian, save the man." This was a philosophy for assimilation. And what this included was removing children from their families at this school and other off-reservation boarding schools. Speaking your native language was forbidden. Siblings were often separated at schools. They really instituted more of a militarized culture, especially in the early years. And most schools established an outing program where children were assigned work to become quote unquote productive citizens, right? This school served as the model for off-reservation boarding schools across the United States and Canada, which then grew into schools such as Haskell Institute, Phoenix Indian Boarding School, and just here in the Inland Empire, Sherman Institute, which is today named Sherman Indian High School. So here at Sherman Institute, which we have some photographs to the left, we have a postcard, and to the right, we have a class of children from I think it was 1902, if I'm not mistaken. But Sherman Institute was called Paris Indian School in 1892 until the federal government moved it to Riverside, California in 1901. After the years of the civil rights and the American Indian movement in the 1970s, the federal government renamed the school Sherman Indian High School in order to shift the school's assimilationist agenda to one more of cultural pride and grounding. So a lot happened throughout those years. The history of boarding schools is complex and his narrative is a lot more diverse than most people think. And so with that, I'd really like to introduce Assemblymember James Ramos to share more about his perspective and insight to Indian boarding schools here in the US, but specifically how it affected California Indian communities. And so I'd like to read a short bio on for Assemblymember James Ramos. He is a lifelong resident of the San Manuel Indian Reservation and a member of the Serrano and Cahuilla tribes. He became the first California Native American state lawmaker in 2018, the first on the San Bernardino County Board of Supervisors, Community College Board of Trustees, and the California Board of Education. His priorities include public service, fostering Native American opportunities and participation, preservation of languages. He has really authored a lot of legislations, which I know he will get into a little bit more today. And so with that, I'd like to go ahead and turn it over to Assemblymember James Ramos. Thank you for being here with us this afternoon.
Well, thank you, Daisy, and thank you for that history of boarding schools in our local area with St. Boniface and Sherman Indian High School that we call it now. But for those on reservations, we know that had been it's a horrid past to many on reservations that have people that talk about the boarding schools, and particularly our family, St. Boniface, where my grandmother, Martha Emanuel Chacon, was sent to. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But what has happened here just recently in the last couple of years is that there's been an awakening of what truly has happened to the Native American people and in Canada, as far as what the boarding schools were and the true history of what is revealing. We know that in Canada, they uncovered several graves. And so that took a lot of attention, not only from the United States, but Canada, but the world. But we also know that boarding schools were something here in the United States. So the same practices that were used during the boarding schools in Carlisle, the terminology of kill the Indian, save the man, was the premise to go out and strip someone of their culture, the language, the songs, the hair, all those things still carried forward over here in the state of California, where now Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, is moving forward on listening sessions throughout the United States. And we would encourage her to be able to come here to California to hear some of the different issues with the listening session. We're talking about Southern California, but boarding schools also were other places in the state of California. But we'll focus strictly here in our area. St. Boniface was one that a lot of Indian people went to that were taken to. My grandmother was one of those, Martha Emanuel Chacon, and she was interviewed and she talked about going there where they wouldn't let her talk their language and where people would get punished, and they would take them out and they would beat them, whip them. And I know this is true, and some say, wow, that didn't happen. But my grandmother, well, she was interviewed, and we have that documentation that she and others, they give them communion, and they would tell them if they didn't take that communion, then they would pass away. So my grandmother and some others that were there with her decided not to take that communion. And so they didn't take it, and they sat in the room waiting to see if they were telling the truth, if they would pass away, and they didn't. So then at that point, they knew that some of the things they were saying were lies to them. And one time, one of the pastors or the priest came and scolded her, and I guess they'd gotten to a confrontation, and then they told her to take off her blouse, and they whipped her with a belt. So we know that did take place because of the firsthand experience and encounters that my grandmother said. But we also know that other places, Indian people still talk about those that went to the boarding schools in St. Boniface and originally in Paris and then now at Sherman. There's 2 locations there. That some Indian people just accepted that they went to the boarding schools and never came home, that an accident happened, whether it was, said to be an accident with equipment or different things, but that's where those graves started to take place. And that's where a lot of the focus is now, and trying to find out, within how many graves there are, how many people are buried there, and the true impact that caused them to pass away. And it's a big issue. Some will say, well, that people did good by going there and teaching Indian people these things, but let's not forget people lost their lives. And how did they lose their lives? Were they beaten? Were they killed? Were they just because they didn't conform to certain things? So that's the question that is still resonating within the Indian community. Now we get to St. Boniface and we talk about Sherman Indian High School, where we're at now. Over time, Sherman Indian High School became now a beacon of light for education attainment. And so right now, currently, Sherman Indian High School serves many reservations and Indian people as a chance to get their high school diplomas. And we start to look at that. And some will say, well, that's a good thing, right? People are moving forward to get their diplomas, but it's one school. And we still have the highest rates of those not attaining high school diplomas. So couldn't the United States do a little bit more to even get engaged to make sure that our people are graduating from school? We still suffer at the higher ratios than other groups in the United States and here in the state of California. So St. Boniface and Sherman Indian High School, as those that know it now, have some history and past to the Indian people. I went out and seen the cemetery that's out there in Riverside. And so we're hoping that by bringing these attentions and these things forward, that it starts to uncover a horrid past of why there's so much neglect for trust within the Indian communities towards the government itself. And when we start to look at how people treated Native American people, and in particular our women, and viewing people as less than human, that their culture, their language, the way they dress was not good enough, right? And so people looked down upon the Indian culture and stripped it away with the assimilations through boarding school. And it wasn't just, cordially asking you not to talk your language or do these things. Once you did it, you were severely beaten or whipped in the case of my grandmother. But we also have to talk about the resiliency of our people to retain that culture, even in those atrocities and things that happened to our people, atrocities, genocide over the years. But the resiliency of our people to continue to hold on to their culture so that I could open up in a traditional song for land acknowledgement, even in this course here today. It's to the resiliency that went through all those things, those trials and tribulations, to be here today to teach us the culture that's there. Certainly, we need to make sure that people understand that there is a horrid past here in the state of California, but we also have to remember the resiliency and the strength of our people that got us to where we are today. Certainly, the mentality that moved forward during those colonizational periods has played out and is still playing out today. When people view you as less than human, and then you move forward into from the missionary period to the gold rush, then you start to see the slavery, the taking of the lands that were there. And then the terminology, we just had a bill that was signed by the governor. We call it the S word. That's a word that's derogatory towards Native American women. And some still think that that's not derogatory towards Native American women. And we call it the S word bill. And once you start to see the mentality that was carried out from the colonizational period to the Mexican rule, to the United States rule, and ultimately the state of California, right? And people view Indian people, California Indian people, as less than human. The Indian people became those indentured slavery for those that came on for the gold rush, and straight out annihilation and genocide that still plays out today. We got that bill signed into law, and it partners with the Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, getting rid of that derogatory name from federal properties. And now, since the governor signed it, this will get rid of that S word from the state of California properties here in the state. And it's just, you know, to look at where we've come and where we're at. The California Indian people, we're talking about boarding schools that happened years back in history, but now we're bringing to light the true aspect and how it actually impacted California Indian people. And it starts with the educational component, right? AB 1703 was signed by the governor, and that deals with the American Indian Education Act. It's a start, and we have to stay together to make sure that we educate the whole state of California on what truly happened to the California Indian people. When we look at and view people as less than human, it gives those the opportunity to form militias, to fund different killing machines in the state of California. Some will say, well, that's harsh language. Well, it happened. And if we're not going to talk about the harsh language that truly happened to the California people, that's why you have some cities in the state of California that have no Indian reservations around them. It wasn't that they were empty with Indian people. It's because they moved in and killed Indian people that were paid militias by the state of California that then got reimbursed by the federal government. And so to be able to sit in the state legislature, and I've opened up in prayer, in traditional song, knowing that in the back of my mind that those in that legislature back in that time also approved the bounties on California Indian people that was paid for by taxpayers' dollars. That also needs to come to light to show what truly has happened here in the state of California. And it also needs to come to light so we can start to deal with the trauma, historical trauma that is still impacting our people. We have the highest suicide rates, highest drug addiction, alcoholism than any other people in the United States. And I believe it goes back to not acknowledging a horrid past so that we can start to heal and move forward. Another bill that I had that got signed into law deals with the founder of this law school in San Francisco. And it was named after its founder that funded militias and killing machines against the Round Valley Indian people and the Yuki Indian people. The governor signed that bill, and it will no longer carry his name. It'll carry a different name. And the law school library now will be renamed according to a Native American name. This is where we're at in the history in the state of California, a changing time for people to be able to understand the trauma and start to make amends for it. And when we start to make amends, then that healing can truly start to take place. We also know that the mentality towards Native American women is something that has been carried on. That's why we have we're number 7 in all states in the nation of unsolved missing and murdered Indigenous women, Indigenous person cases in the United States. And so we brought that to light through a hearing. And I'm happy to say that the governor signed into law, AB 1314, that for the first time we would create like an Amber Alert, but it's going to be called Feather Alert. When a missing person goes missing from an Indian reservation or an Indian community in the state of California, it'll trigger the different awareness alert system that's there. That's called the Feather Alert system now. And that was signed into law by Governor Newsom. And it's similar to the Amber Alerts and the Silver Alerts. So now that's actually moving forward. But there's a lot more work to do. And so when you talk about race and racism and the policing, there is a distrust that's there. But we're starting to break that down by having Feather Alert move forward, have the California Highway Patrol engage with tribal communities to be able to issue that Feather Alert. We have a long way to go, but it starts with acknowledging a horrid past, but also acknowledging the resiliency and the strength of our elders to continue to move forward through all those atrocities so that we could be here today and even talk about these issues within this class. There's a lot of other bills that we moved forward on and got signed into law. Since we've been in office in 2018 in the state legislature, we've authored and got so many bills in front of the governor dealing with Indian issues, from cultural preservation to protection of Native American women, to renaming an affluent law school out in San Francisco and to getting Feather Alert done. Those are just a snapshot of where we're at. But it starts with that understanding of moving forward and how do we move forward with our community to make sure that they truly understand why certain Indian communities feel the way they do. And once people start to acknowledge that, I believe we're on the road to healing. Thank you.
Thank
Is
you.
that it?
Oh, excuse me. Yeah. Assemblymember James Ramos, I definitely feel free, any of the participants, to include any of your thoughts or questions here at the bottom. I know I have a couple of questions, as I'm sure that a lot of our panelists here do too. As you mentioned, it's really an exciting time of change, as well as you know, confronting this history, and a history that doesn't just stay in the past, right? But a history that weaves into the present. And you know, as we have more representation, these conversations are definitely going to start changing. I was curious if you could talk a little bit more of, I know during the pandemic, we saw this really historic moment of the removal of Confederate monuments, right? We saw the removal of mission monuments. And I think within our space here, we've been discussing so much the profiling of Black and brown and Native bodies, but I think that moment just spread so much awareness because of the history tied to it, right? And I think there was this genuine desire to rewrite history. And I know you've done a lot of work here in California. We saw Sarah, but I know you've done a lot of work at the Capitol as well with a monument up there. And I was hoping if you could share a little bit more about these monuments, what they represent, and what the public interest is changing as well, you know, and you know, I was just hoping you could talk a little bit more about that.
Definitely. During that time in the state capitol, there was a protest and the Junipero Serra statue came down. I immediately wrote a letter to Rules Committee, Joint Rules, asking them not to put that statue back up until they have meaningful dialogue with the local tribes to understand what that truly meant to the California Indian people by trying to put that back up. And there was no discussion. So I introduced a bill, AB 338, that called for the removal of the Junipero Serra statue and to be replaced with a California Indian monument from the local people right there in Sacramento, the Miwok, Nisenan people. But it started to open up the dialogue of what that truly meant. And everywhere that we would go and see monuments up, it reminds us of the Spanish missionary system, right? The boarding schools, the taking of Indian people. And it was a horrid past, right? A horrid past to where missions would come in and try to civilize Indian people, they would say. And it's also a time to where it was well documented, right? Where Junipero Serra was out in the Monterey Bay, and he had Indian people, both sexes and kids, shackled by chains. And the French president scolded him for that. And that's the mentality that they've had. And I got into heavy debate with a certain senator from San Diego over that issue. And I brought up the shackling and the chains, and he said, well, he's Assemblymember, that was just a form of public safety back then. And I said, excuse me, but you know, this ground is still crying out from our ancestors to tell the state of California who we are as California Indian people and the atrocities that move forward. I was able to lobby that bill through the Assembly, the Senate, got to the governor to sign that into law. And I'm glad you bring that up, because in November, we're planning on having a groundbreaking for the statue that's going to replace Junipero Serra statue on the Capitol grounds. And so 338 still moves forward. And after that, after the governor signed that bill into law, is when that law school called and said that they were now thinking of renaming their institution, right? And so that started the whole ball rolling. But we have to come together as a people and start to work to get rid of these things throughout the state of California and start to identify what these truly mean, these monuments mean. I mean, certainly the Juniper Serra statue there, but the Sutter, locally, we see a lot more, like the different names in sports, right? Those different sports teams that mimic chanting and those things. Those are things that should be addressed, right? But somehow, when it comes to Native American issues, it always comes up and then disappears. And so we have to gain allies within the community to be able to move forward. And case in point, the Women's Caucus joined me, the Native American Legislative Caucus, in moving forward on getting rid of the S word and moving forward on the feather alert system. So we have to be able to join forces on those issues moving forward. After all, your issues are our issues are your issues. We're all one people now, being able to stand up and fight back and to have that voice that was oppressed for so many years. It's time for that voice to be heard. Similar to what that senator told me, that, you know, he wanted to be the paternal approach and give me the history. And I said, well, isn't it time for our own people to be able to tell you the history that has impacted us? And he wasn't able to defend himself anymore.
Oh, sure.
James, on we're lucky to have you at the Capitol, and it's so important that you keep fighting the fight. But I just want to, could you touch on the federal level, what's going on in the whole United States?
Oh yeah, on the federal level, there's so many issues going on right now. One in particular that we're watching is the ICWA challenge into the Supreme Court, Indian Child Family Welfare Act, that was implemented so that Indian kids could get back to the tribal communities to learn their culture and history because of what happened over history, taking Indian kids from Indian families, putting them with other families, so that they, even though the boarding schools and those things, and in our area, the boarding schools were running until late, right? And so it was something that still played into all these things that we're talking about. But now the Supreme Court is looking at hearing this case because in Texas, a family filed a lawsuit against ICWA, challenging it, saying that Indian families shouldn't have first priority of having kids coming to from the foster care system, from the courts, that other families, non-Native American families, should have a right also. But the whole reason for that act is to get kids back into the families with Native American people to learn their culture and to learn their history. And that's been a law that's been here for years. Now that's under attack. Certainly at the federal level, Secretary Deb Haaland, the first Native American to be able to lead and be a secretary in the United States, has moved forward on so many grounds. And one of those is boarding schools that's so dear to her. Also with Carlisle having a personal testimony there from her own. And so now we're working to justify a lot of the wrongs that have been impacted upon our people. The S word is another one that we're dealing with. So at the federal level, we're dealing with Supreme Court rulings that could change the tide, that could become the modern day boarding school systems to strip Indian people of their heritage and knowledge. If others get that opportunity to go back in time to have non-Native American families be the first ones to adopt, they're never going to learn their language. And then our language and our culture starts to disseminate even more.
Go ahead, Mary.
Thanks. It's so interesting, Assemblymember Ramos. I was just reading about that case, that the case of the adoptive child who was removed and put into a white family's home. And in that article, they cited the United Nations declaring that removing children from their communities is a form of genocide. But this white family is arguing, no, they need to be able to eat and to have shelter and all of that. But to me, the genocide issue trumps anything else. Is that the way you see it?
It definitely does. It definitely trumps everything else. I mean, when we talk about genocide, is impacted upon the California Indian people and the Native American people in the United States. But we also have laws that were ingrained with that mentality of changing Indian people into mainstream. So we talk about foster care. I have a bill that the governor did sign, and it talks about being able to have compensation for homes, non-Native American homes, when they're ready to have foster care. When a student or kids come in, they get some compensation to upgrade their home. Do you know that Native American families never got any money for compensation, even though they're offering their home? So when they came in to inspect the house, this house passed, Native American houses needed more work. So now, because we were able to fine tune that bill to make it now that Native American families are able to get that compensation, that balanced it out. And it was last year that the governor signed that bill. So here in 2021, we're still fighting pieces of legislation that were created not to support Indian people, but to create that assimilation. So we have to continue to look at these bills and to move forward. And when ICWA moves forward and the assimilation and the genocide, the topic of genocide is something that I've had to educate a lot of people in the legislature on, and especially my friends in the Jewish caucus, who now also support the issues that we're dealing with, and they call it genocide, what happened to the California Indian people.
Yeah, there is a film that I show to my class. My class is called Ishi, the Last Yahi. And it is, I think, a microcosm of what happened to Native Americans. I mean, he was really the last member of his tribe. And he was caged in a museum in Berkeley, at Cal Berkeley. He was poked and prodded, and he died very, very young. I mean, I think he was in his 30s when he died, but it's kind of an example of how they were not seen as fully human, you know, not the way he was treated. And so I would highly recommend that any of your colleagues who are still having to be pulled along, that they see that film, because it's really quite moving, and it's actually available on YouTube.
There's another book that Benjamin Madley wrote, American Genocide, that talks about all these documented cases of genocide and makes the case using the United Nations definition of genocide. Even though some still here in the United States will not accept that genocide was enacted upon Indian people, they state the case. And in the United Nations, we've met so many of that criteria that it can't be called anything else. When you take somebody away from their family, you strip them of their culture, of their language. And if they refuse to give up their language, you beat and kill them. That's what these boarding schools are about, and that's what it's going to uncover. There's no other way to get around it. You have the state of California that was covered. Every piece of it was covered with California Indian people. And now you have some cities that have no federally recognized Indian reservations, but that doesn't mean nobody lived there. There's people there. As you're driving the streets, as you're walking around the neighborhoods, underneath those grounds, there's California Indian people crying out, tell them who we are, because they're buried in the ground here in the state of California.
Mm-hmm. James, there is I'll see if the attendee wants to ask their question, but could you speak a little bit more? There's kind of these two different spaces that I see. So that here in California, on one end, I'm reminded how not too long ago we got that teacher from Riverside that was mocking Native culture and, just really playing into all the stereotypes that, people have been working for so long to combat, right? It went viral, and luckily it did go viral, right? Because it's creating that visibility, even with just students that were in the classroom. And then on the other hand, I see just so much powerful momentum like the California Indian Nations College, right? Which is an initiative to bring about a Native, essentially community college here in Coachella. And so there's these kind of two different energies, if you will, going on. And I was hoping if you could talk about those two and kind of what they represent and what work needs to be done in between all that space for all of us.
So I think it's been happening to many of us going through public school. When I went through Belvedere Elementary School here in San Bernardino, would leave the reservation and walk to school. We were in class and the teacher played a drum song and asked who's Native American. We raised our hand and she said, well, tell us what that song meant. And we said, well, we don't know because it's not our culture. And she said, well, sit down, you must not be Indian enough. And so at that point, we didn't want to go back to school, right? But it stuck in my mind. So then we started the California Indian Coach Awareness Conference with the help of Mr. Robert Levi, the elders here on campus, his father. We started the California Indian Conference to teach people about our factual songs using gourd rattles, hoofs of animals, but not so much the drum in this local area. And then that happened back then. And then you see the thing happen in Riverside. And that's just a case where we know that other schools and classrooms are still teaching some of those things. But what happened here was somebody recorded it, documented it, and it went viral. And then we ended up and happened to be in the state legislature, had a hearing down there, a joint hearing with the school board to start to address it. That's where a lot of the task force came together. We put together Lucenio people, Serrano, Cuia, and Gabrieno there to talk about the issues and to offer to the school advisement and, you know, different things to make sure things were culturally sensitive. And it's not just about what's being taught in the classroom. That particular teacher, right, chose to teach that and frolic around like an Indian in the classroom. And that's happening other places, just nobody's recording it. So we have to make sure that we're working with the local educational institution, but we can't rely on the schools to make the decisions on their own. We have to include the Indian people. That's why AB 1703 calls for American Indian task force from the local tribes in the local areas to partner with the local school districts to review curriculum, to look at the sensitivity of classes and all those things that are there, but it takes the Indian people to be that voice moving forward. And then Sync College, we were able to get them from the state of California, $5 million to go towards federal accreditation. And if they get the federal accreditation, it'll be the first accredited Indian college here in the state of California. Across the nation, other states have federally accredited Indian colleges, but California is home to more individual tribal people than any other state in the nation, and we have none. And so it took us to get the $5 million to move forward with the accreditation. And I also just, I know we might be running short on time, but I do want to make a statement also to those that are hearing this or that might review it later at a certain time. Let's not be fooled by the Indian tribes that are doing successful in gaming. The majority of the California Indian people and the Indian people in the nation still have infrastructure basic needs that need to happen. We need to make sure we're having that voice for all people. That's why we deal with the feather alert. That's why we deal with the S word. That's why we deal with all these different issues. And we need more California Indian people elected into the state legislature and involved in the political system at the county board of supervisors, the school boards. We need people engaged, because then when our voice is being heard around the table, that's when we're truly having an impact on the decisions that are happening to California and the lands that are traditionally, ancestrally our own.
Mm-hmm.
Can I follow up? Just
ahead.
just a quick question, please. Assemblymember Ramos, you just mentioned that most, and you said it, I think a few minutes ago, that on any list of well-being for a community, Native Americans are at the bottom. In terms of health, in terms of education, etc. I often have the question in my classes like, yeah, what do you mean? What do you mean they're poor or they're undereducated? Look at all those fancy casinos they have. And you just mentioned that. Could you kind of expound on why, given that there are these beautiful casinos, that Native Americans still are at the bottom when it comes to quality of life issues?
I think that when you start to understand the whole gaming in IGRA, it was created for economic development. On our reservation, we had horse stables, we sold cigarettes, and all that was taken because we couldn't figure out how to challenge in court. So bingo came. But it was a step to open up the window to address all the issues that impact our people. Back in the 70s, when I was growing up, there was missing and murdered Indigenous women back then. There was EPA issues, there was domestic violence, there was alcoholism, drug addiction, all those things that still plague our communities and still plague pretty much communities outside of the reservation. But what are we doing to address those issues, right? And now we've gone from people not even knowing we existed to all of a sudden associating casinos and gaming to all Indian people. And that's just not the case. There's so much in between here and here that we haven't even begun to uncover. We're starting to peel back that layer of the onion, talking about the boarding schools from the beginning, from the missionary system and the impact that it's had on California people. And then after that, we have the Mexican rule that was pretty horrid towards California people also. And then the United States rule that was again carried over from the different slavery tactics over into California. And then the state of California, where the first governor put out bounties and paid for militias to go out and kill Indian people. We went from here, nobody knowing that history, to all of a sudden associating all tribes, all Indian people with gaming. And that's just not the case. There's a handful of successful tribes that are doing successful in gaming, but the majority do not have the infrastructure that's there. The high school education attainment across the board for Indian people in the state of California is below the average of others that are there. Suicide rates are higher than any other group that's out there. Domestic violence, alcoholism, murder on reservation lands. These are things that we still need to address.
And James, in the same light, we talk about race and policing. And so could you touch a little bit about policing? Because one of the things I've seen in my travels is you go through different areas. When you go to Lake Powell, you go through different tribal areas, and what you're talking about is so very true. It's like blight. Indians on the side of the road, poor. You see the shacks that they're living in, but at the same time, there's policing going on. And how does that affect the tribes, not only in the boarding schools, on the reservations, at the casinos, all around?
So in the state of California, we're considered a public law 280 state. And I believe there was a handful of states that were given that public law 280. So that means that the policing jurisdiction still resides within the state and the local jurisdictions. So here, we still rely on the county sheriff's department in many areas. On our particular reservation, we have a contract with the county sheriff's department, so they patrol the reservation. But what about the other reservations, tribal governments that have no resources? So they depend strictly upon the law enforcement surrounding the community. And sometimes they respond, sometimes there's a lot of tension that takes place. And so understanding that law, and there's some that won't even respond to reservations because they don't understand the public law 280 system and who has jurisdiction on those. And then not only that, you deal with a community that went through so much historical trauma, who to trust. There's things on the reservation. I grew up and seeing things and things that have affected us. Things happen that nobody even talks about because people feel that they have no one to tell people what has happened to them. Because even if they tell somebody, that no one's going to investigate it, no one's going to stand up for them as a victim of crime. On reservations, it's happening every day. And yet, we start to see a lot of the topics and dialogue move forward with the policing and racism. But when you still deal with the people that aren't even coming forward when bad things are happening to them because they feel no one's even going to look into it, that's a problem.
Yeah, I appreciate, because I think everything you mentioned, from mission to gold rush to statehood, right? The criminality just has been, it's never been considered a crime, right? So to suddenly see law enforcement and be asked to trust, that's a nearly impossible thing to do, but there was one attendee that Elena, that had a question, and I wanted to turn it over to her.
Yes, hi, good afternoon. Thank you so much. First off, I just wanted to say thank you for your time and shedding light on this, because unfortunately, Native Americans are not that adverse in this world, and we don't have a lot of representation, so I do appreciate that. I was trying to raise my hand, but the comments and chat was locked, so it was disabled. I couldn't put it in there. But my biggest question was in regards to trying to even look into your roots. I was wanting to see about a link or any more information, or just with you personally, who's at Cal State San Bernardino, to get information on trying to get in contact, because he was stating it's really hard to, which it is. I'm with White Mountain, and I've tried to look in Riverside, Temecula. I finally found what the Apache White Mountain tribe is actually located all the way in Arizona. They won't even verify me unless I physically go down there with my father and with his native number to try and register me. And I'm 40% native. Just to see, it came up in regards to transferring to Cal State San Bernardino. A girlfriend of mine at Norco College had said her tribe is over in Temecula, like one of the casino ones. So they're paying for her education. And I was like, I don't think so. I think it's a small tribe. Last I heard about it was a small gathering in Northern California by San Jose, that there was like an office you can go to where my grandmother went. But there's literally no resources to like find out about your roots. It's disheartening that it would be so difficult. So I just appreciate you taking the time to shed some light, and just trying to give any information to help those like me that just want to know more about their history.
Definitely. I mean, I think some of the laws and research and those records weren't held so that Indian people could continue to flourish. But there, I believe there still is, I might be wrong, but in the city of Riverside, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and they've kept records there. That might be an area for you to be able to go and look at and research some of that.
Thank you.
And it's not a surprise to anyone, I think, that it is so difficult to find who you are. And that's, for some people who can, trace their lineage 20 generations, would not appreciate Elena's emotion and her frustration over not being able to find out who she is. And the same thing happens with African Americans. I don't even know what my name is. I know what my slave master's name is, but I don't know what my name is, so it's very, very, very difficult.
Absolutely. Thank you for that question. And right, Mary, Stan, Cecilia, is there any other question that you'd like to introduce, or from our guest?
I think there was an original question about comparing what happened here with Native Americans, and it seems to have disappeared, Native Americans versus the Philippines. That I guess colonialism works the same everywhere. It's almost like there's a blueprint.
This is Robert. I answered that
Hi,
question
Robert.
since
Okay.
since I taught U.S. history for 40 years.
Oh, great.
And I'm the grunt. I'm not like Assemblymember Ramos or Dr. Ocampo I was the grunt in the field at Sherman Indian High School. I was there for, like I mentioned, 2 years teaching the students, and plus my father and mother both worked there. My dad went to St. Boniface, and so again, looking at the race issue in terms of boarding schools, we've heard what has happened and a little bit of what's happening today, but that's my issue is through the educational process about as Assemblymember Ramos mentioned, we need more people in the government, more Indians in the government. But again, my solution to this Indian issue, and again, there was no Indian problem before non-Indians got here. So once we have this invasion, we become a problem or an issue. So now what I'm looking to is not only the politicians, the Indian politicians, but also Indians in education. That's my push here at CSUSB. And Dr. Campos and I kind of mentioned this yesterday in our meeting, is that trying to recruit Indian students to come here and then create a pathway through the education department and create a fifth and sixth year schooling that would include a master's, getting an MED and a credential at the same time, and then begin to flood the IE with Indian educators and maybe also expand it to Nevada and Arizona. So, and again, my experience again with Sherman is also in 1982, the federal government closed down Intermountain boarding school in Utah, and I helped close that school down, which was an experience. And also in 1982, the federal government issued that Phoenix Indian School would begin to be closed down, and I was part of that, taking that school apart. And within the idea of Indian education, that is my solution, and that is my wife's solution. Also, if you haven't had a chance to go on the Truth and Healing Council for California Indians, I would highly recommend that, and listen to the actual California Indians talking about what they see as issues in that area within the state of California. I'm on the subcommittee for Indian education, so again, I can't emphasize pushing educating our youth. And also, if you're a teacher, further look at from boarding schools to suspension boards. A very well put together 2020 report on the state of Indian education, not only in the state of California, but around the nation. And it's not funded by the BIA or BIE. It's funded by just American Indians or the California state legislature. So again, it's a really comprehensive task force put together to create that report. And again, and that's kind of dealing up with what's happening with Sherman Indian High School right now. It's still there. There's they got through COVID and now just trying to survive with the students that they have there that are still being sent to that boarding school. The school board is now all California or other Indian tribes that are being represented on the school board. So that was one plus. But again, we're looking at what Sherman needs is a lot more help from the federal government, because they're under the BIE. So, the Bureau of Indian Education. So again, if we could contact Secretary of Interior Deb Haaland and ask her what could be done with one of the 4 left boarding schools. I think Oregon, Oklahoma, and I'm guessing South Dakota are the only states that have federally run BIE boarding schools. So again, in addressing that issue of what can occur on boarding schools, and then also the policing idea on boarding schools, or as Assemblymember Ramos was talking about, we're a PL 280 state, and so on my reservation, that Torres Martinez, it's either sheriffs or the California Highway Patrol, but we also have security there that is tribal security. But again, they can only detain, they can't arrest, and they have to wait for the 2 other agencies to come onto the reservation and handle it from there. And like Assemblymember Ramos said, sometimes, we're not high priority. And so it could be an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours until something happens. And then using that time frame, they just let them go because they can't. They got to be all over the reservation. So again, looking at the issues, we still, the light at the end of the tunnel is, for me, is education. Also with Assemblymember Ramos was AB 1703 with California Indian history being, how do they say, being put into the CDE social studies history framework. There's also ethnic studies. And what the only issue I would find with that, and also with AB 1703, is who's teaching our history. And right now within the state of California, I believe there's only 5% American Indian teachers. And then we do that with next study, ethnic studies, you can have non-Indians sympathizing with us, but they can't empathize with us. That's they'll walk a mile in my moccasins, that kind of idea. So, there may be other issues that the California Teachers Association will have to deal with in terms of who's doing the teaching. And again, Assemblymember Ramos had a bill through that. You have to have tribal consultation. So hopefully, and when I'm working with districts, Castro Valley is one of the districts we're working with, Liberated Ethnic Studies out of Cal State Northridge. And so hopefully we're looking for tribal consultation with whether curriculum they're going to implement K through 12. So again, if we have any educators on, I would highly recommend looking toward California Teachers Association, the American and Alaska Native Caucus, and asking if they have any questions about tribal consultation or any other issues in terms of looking at teaching Indian children in the public schools, which my grandchildren are going through that. I did not. Well, K through 6, I was in public ed, and then from then I went to Notre Dame High School in Riverside, and then on to San Diego State University. But again, looking at what can be done, how you can help us, is again just realizing who you're dealing with and trying to get more background. Like the person was mentioning about White Mountain Apache, that's a tribal sovereignty issue. And it's terrible that it comes down to that. But again, it's adding a membership to the tribe, and sometimes tribes are very cautious about who they enroll, especially if they're casino based. But again, I wouldn't give up. I would go to the BIA website and look what agency. I don't think Southern California is included, well, Southern California agency. So I'm guessing it's going to be the Arizona BIA that may help you. But again, you may have to address the tribal council or the tribal chairman or enrollment. But again, don't give up. There's, tell your story. And again, hopefully that will help you get that. And I wish you the best of luck. So that was my 30 seconds of blurping. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Robert. And, just in terms of staying involved, if you're interested in just learning more, attend a powwow, attend a California Indian Day. November is Native American Heritage Month. Take a class, take my class, take Professor Madrigal's class, follow Assemblymember James Ramos on social media. Just stay up to date. The Sherman Indian High School has the Sherman Indian Museum. You can stop by and learn that history, learn all the different narratives that are there. Some people had a great experience, for example, being on a sport at Sherman, because that had a lot of credit and currency among the community. There's a lot of different narratives there at Sherman. I invite you to go there. And about the question with the Philippines, although I'm not too familiar with the Philippines, as just thinking about it broad picture, education almost always got weaponized when it came to Native communities, right? And oftentimes it was tied to land, right? My tribe comes from Mexico, and my tribe had Pueblo status, which is kind of equivalent to federal recognition. We had not a boarding school. They looked more like the day schools, where the school was within the community, so the kids weren't leaving necessarily. But nonetheless, it was the last time in 1924 when our language was spoken. Why is that? Because the language was forbidden. So then you get Spanish instituted and normalized, right? So these are some of the ways, and as you have less people speaking the language, we lost, for example, our Pueblo status, which is our community recognition, right? And that all came down to land because we lost so much of our community holdings this way. So it's kind of always important to think about what the objective and the outcome was, and what they were after, right? And oftentimes, as we saw in the little presentation I did at the beginning, it was tied to land, right? Moving west. And I think we're up against time, but I want to go ahead and turn it over to Cecilia.
I just had a quick question. Two things. Mr. Levi and Assemblymember Ramos, thank you so much for all of your work, because a lot of us wouldn't know about this stuff. I was a student and I had never really had any information. I'm an older student, so I've been through the California, Los Angeles school system, and we weren't taught these things. And it wasn't until I got to Cal State, and one of my first classes, I learned about Junipero Serra. And I tell you, every time I hear somebody mention that name, I'm giving them the information. So when you talk about education, I think that is absolutely, absolutely important. Any student out there that's looking, Dr. Ocampo has an absolutely wonderful class about the West, and I learned so much in that class. It was very eye-opening for me. My question, though, however, is how do you deal with people who are trying to rewrite history? All this America First stuff, and they're, 1776 is when this country started and all this. How do you deal with that other than education? How do you put this information out? California's doing great because of your work, but what about the rest? What about the rest?
I don't know if Mr. Levi wanted to tackle that, or who was the question for?
Sure. Usually what I find, and then the best way to get the word out is through the Teachers Association, the unions. Again, we have the National Education Association meeting once a year at the end of July, and usually that's when we can talk to other states about how they're handling Indian issues or Indian education. And sometimes it is, I don't want to use the word frightening, but very aghast, I guess, about what they know about their local tribes. And then I didn't know that. And then that's our part to help them, point them in the right direction to find out different issues that are happening here. And again, at CSUSB, we have, Dr. Ocampo's class, and then we have, which madrigal? I can't even remember, but we only have 2 classes in American Indian that deals with American Indians. Hopefully we're going to remedy that with creating an American Indian history department. That's on our agenda. And again, looking at the other books that are coming out, we have just as many authors that are coming with a rejuvenated ideal about what's happening. The late Vine Deloria Jr. was just a masterful individual about American Indian history and American philosophy. We need people to step up. His son, I think he's at one of the Ivy schools. He's got books coming out. And again, there's now Daisy knows who it is. It's Willie over at UNLV. Bound, yes, he's another up and coming great author about Indian history. And again, just looking at the local, if they can find out what the local tribes are doing in terms of, like Daisy was talking about, up in Northern California, you go to a big time, one of their gatherings are every university has a powwow. Stanford has a powwow. The Claremont colleges have a powwow. We just had a powwow. Like I said, just go to powwow and we're still vibrant now. We're not going to be getting rid of it. We're still going to be here with like bad luggage and the luggage you want to get rid of, but that's not going to happen. But education-wise, with something like Ramos, more educational bills would be helpful. But again, we need to find the Indian educators to teach the classes. That's my only concern, and hopefully we'll address that issue with that dual degrees that we'll hopefully have in about, I hope 2 years, maybe 3. But that is my answer. James?
Yeah, I think by having solidarity with different groups, also with the Latino population, the African American population, and populations that are out there that see this as something that's worthy to get around and support. The reason we got bills through the legislature is because we teamed up with the Women's Caucus and some of the other caucus, Latino caucus. And so once you hear what we're talking about here today, go out and continue to share it. And know that every time that we see and hear certain things going on in schools, like what happened in Riverside, and the last day of session, I had to write a letter to a county board of supervisor in San Benito County, because on the dais, he said that it was harder to get people to agree than a bunch of Indians, and freely saying that. And someone sent it to me and we asked for clarification. He said, sorry, I meant to say chiefs. So that was even worse. And so by having people basically being eyes and ears of what's right and what's wrong and calling them on it helps us to be able to further that cause. Because we wrote a letter signed by, I think, over 28 legislators to that county supervisor, putting them on warning that's not the correct way to use language. And so I think there has to be as others continue to move forward, especially within the Latino population, African-American population, policing, education, all those different things. Let's remember that, let's carry our brothers and sisters who originally were here in the state of California along with that journey to correct the history, not only in the state of California, but across the nation. So it takes being allies and being able to stand together in unity.
Thank you, Assemblymember Ramos. I just want to say, on behalf of the Futch family, we're sorry for your loss, and
Thank
that
you.
we will be there representing my brother John. So I just want you to know that. Also on a WAG's account, you're more than welcome to join us. I know it's an election year, and so please give me a call and we'll schedule a time you can come and join us. And oh, my wife's sitting here. She said hi.
I said hi.
All right. So I know our time is up, and Assemblymember James Ramos, I know your time is precious at the Capitol. And with that, I just want to again say thank you for joining us this afternoon. Thank you for sharing space and for sharing your stories, your family stories, and the work that you're doing. And all of us, we will continue to follow you and do our part as much as we can. And with that, I just want to say thank you. Unless Mary, do we have anything else?
Thank you so much.
That is all. I think that's all. I have a quick question for the Assembly member, though. I'm just trying to contact someone in the Assembly who may be involved in criminal justice issues. I know there's a committee, but I don't know the name of it. Off the top of your head, do you know anyone who I might contact?
The social justice, they have
no one specifically on law enforcement and criminal justice and the prison.
Yeah, there's a public safety committee.
Oh, okay.
There. The chair is current chair is there, so you can look at that.
Is who?
The chair of the public safety committee. We got to double check it because people are switching around a little bit.
Okay,
so.
okay,
But it's
I'll
the
look it up
public
then.
safety committee.
Okay.
Reggie Jones Sawyer is the chairman.
Okay, fantastic, fantastic.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm sorry to.
Reggie Jones Sawyer.
Okay, thank you, and thanks again on behalf of the committee, on behalf of the work that we've been doing for the last 2 and almost a half years. We so appreciate your time, all of you. Our time is increasingly more precious as we get into this, crazy rat race, but and so we doubly appreciate what you have done for us today and for our students and the community. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.